Continuing in verse 48, and say we not well that thou art a Samaritan and hast a devil? Aren't you possessed with a devil, a sad man whose brain is clouded, or a mad man whose brain is heated, and whatever you say shouldn't any more be believed than the flashy nonsense of a troubled man or one who's delirious and hallucinating? Again, nothing new here. Divine revelations from God, those things which are above the discovery of reason, our ability to think and draw conclusions, have often been branded with the charge of obsession. And the prophet was called a mad fellow in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 11. And in Hosea chapter 9, verse 7. Now don't speak to me about obsession. We've all seen what happens to people when a small ball is hit over a fence, or a piece of rubber lands into a net, or when an even smaller ball rolls into a hole in the ground. Now one would think being saved from the second death is a bit more something to get enthusiastic about. Now here one would think that Jesus' excellent discussions would have changed their opinion about him and made them take back what they said about him and his teaching. But instead of this, their hearts were hardened even more, and their intolerance was proved. They valued themselves on their opposition to Jesus, as if they'd never spoken better than when they spoke the worst they could about him. Those have arrived at the highest pitch of wickedness who justify themselves in that for which they ought to condemn themselves. When Jesus spoke with so much boldness against the sins and disobediences of men, and in doing so infuriated them against him, those who were sensible of no other interest but what is secular and worldly and sensual, concluded him to be beside himself, because they thought that none but a madman would risk his life for his religion and conscience. Verse 49, Jesus answered, I have not a devil. Now, he proved that by what he did against the devil's kingdom. None so blind as can't see. He says, but I honor my Father. Now, we can see here the mercifulness and meekness and gentleness of heaven shining in Jesus' reply to this inexcusable insult that he had a devil. By saying that he honored his Father, this also proved that he didn't have a devil, because if he had a devil wouldn't honor God truthfully. Now, some claim to honor God, but an investigation and correct knowledge of God's Word will prove who is and who isn't. Jesus continues in verse 49. And ye do dishonor me. Now by this it appears that as a man he did have a tender sense of disgrace and indignity and dishonor done to him. Accusations were a sword in his bones, and yet he underwent them for our salvation and rescue from the second death. It's the will of God that all men should honor his Son, yet there are many that dishonor him. Such an opposition as this is there in the carnal and worldly mind to the will of God. Jesus honored his Father as never any man did, and yet he himself was so dishonored as never any man was.